The quote, "All I know is that I know nothing," is often attributed to Socrates. And even though this is not an exact quote, it's a loose paraphrasing of what he said when he was confronted with his own wisdom. It became known as Socratic ignorance, which became a central part of Socratic philosophy and philosophy in general. There are many schools of philosophy though, and not all of them begin with ignorance. A lot of them begin with a priori, an axiom, or a brute fact. This is something that Nietzsche heavily criticized in his first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, when he discussed the prejudices of philosophers, saying basically that one cannot pursue knowledge without a prior conviction. Even thinkers like Joseph Ratzinger, a former pope and very good theologian, concede to the idea that there simply is no objective pursuit of truth. The truth is relative to the seeker, that the answer of the question is not independent to the question itself, but that it is contingent to it. As when we ask questions, there is a specific facet of reality that interests us, and thus reality interests us in a specific way. For example, if I were to ask the question, "What is a tomato?" a culinary student might answer the question by saying it's a vegetable, whereas a botany student might say it's a fruit. This is to say that everyone sees truth in their own way. Even two culinary students might look at the tomato in a different way and use it in different ways. The problem is that if we grant that we can't really be objective observers, that we are in the hunt of a specific kind of truth, then why pursue objectivity at all? And once we've found it, why should we know, or why should we be so convinced of its existence? If we grant that we cannot be objective about the pursuit of truth, then we have to be skeptical about the truth we find. Nietzsche was not a fan of religious thinking. Among many of his aphorisms, this one stands out. A philosophical spirit will always have assumed that a proper critique of religious convictions presupposes the enlightenment of mankind, the maturity of human race. But the religious instinct in its most powerful form allows no such critique. It simply rejects it. Faith means not wanting to know what is true. It's easy to argue that a philosopher has to be open-minded. Truly open-minded to the point of agnosticism and skepticism. And so by this merit, it is the unfortunate reality of a philosopher that he cannot plant himself in a belief system. That he cannot take root in a form of knowledge without at the same time remaining open-minded enough so as to consider the merit and probability of adjacent belief systems, which contrasts the one he holds. And so therefore, under this view, it is impossible for a philosopher to be religious, to be dogmatic, and by the same token, be faithful to his philosophy. But is philosophy just about the constant state of wonder? Or is it a way to understand ourselves and our existence so that we may live accordingly with what truths we have found? Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, René Girard, Kierkegaard, and Edith Stein argue that philosophy is not just a pursuit of truth through rigorous skepticism, but the deepening of a value system that seeps into our way of life and shapes not just how we think, but how we act. Thomas Aquinas believed that religion and philosophy were complementary, that philosophical pursuit leads to the question of God, a question answered only by theology. St. Augustine believed that philosophy was subservient to religion, that faith is a true mechanism of knowledge, which extends even to secular thinkers whose beliefs are many times rooted not in logic or reason, but in faith, like the belief in consciousness. René Girard saw religion as a fundamental way of understanding the human culture, including philosophy. He even criticized Western society for secularizing religious ideas. He argued that philosophy often leads to abstraction and distances people from authentic faith, which is similar to the view of phenomenology, a philosophy that argues against abstraction as it can lead to a reduction of the human experience that strips away crucial elements that are important to find in truth. Faith in God is the antidote, as it works as a way to find truth through faith rather than through abstraction. Edith Stein saw philosophy as a means to deepening religious understanding. As a student of Edmund Husserl, she combined Husserl's realist phenomenology with Thomist metaphysics, arguing that reason can lead to faith, but it cannot replace it. She sees faith as the enrichment of philosophy. Another thinker comes to mind that I should mention. Joseph Ratzinger made an excellent point in his book, An Introduction to Christianity. He posits that the structure of religion and the structure of philosophy are the opposite. While philosophy begins with the act of thinking, which then turns into the spoken word, faith begins with the spoken word. And then this spoken word can be implemented into our intellect. Our intellect does not shape our faith, but our faith shapes our intellect. I assume that at this point of the video, you're frustrated that I haven't really defined philosophy. But what is philosophy? And more importantly, is it a means to an end? Or is it an end in itself? Well, philosophy is a way of thinking, a way of analyzing truth. Philosophy allows us to look at the mechanisms that gives life its form. Whether it comes from existence, ethics, morality, beauty, reason, philosophy aims to unravel the mysteries behind these complex concepts. Though unlike scientific method, philosophy does not always operate in a formulaic sense. Yes, when it comes to reason and logic, syllogisms are the name of the game. But when it comes to beauty and ethics, they don't always work, leaving the philosopher to have to employ other methods of reasoning to arrive not at a conclusion, but at a trailhead. This is an important bit. Reading philosophy can be a very dissatisfying experience, as seldom does philosophy arrive at a specific conclusion. But if you pay close attention, philosophy often arrives at the beginning of a path. That is to say, it asks a question which answer lays at the foot of a way of life. For instance, hedonism argues that life can be reduced to pain and pleasure, and that humans ought to seek pleasure and avoid pain. This might sound like a conclusion, but it really is the starting point of a way of life. A way of life that, if followed through, can lead to concepts like antinatalism, consequentialism, and pessimism sometimes, as suffering is everywhere, while pleasure is fleeting. The point is that typically philosophical thinking is more involved than we realize. How we think tends to translate into our actions. Our philosophy shapes our behavior, and thus, for philosophy to be materialized, it has to arrive at a starting point, at least. Secularists posit that philosophy is not about arriving at a conclusion, but about its constant journey to discovery. Religious thinkers don't disagree. They view truth as an ever-revealing process in which the hand of God guides his people through the turmoil of a noisy world. So can a philosopher be religious? The answer depends on how one defines philosophy. If philosophy is merely about doubt, then perhaps not. But if it's about seeking the deepest truths and living accordingly, then religion might not only be compatible with philosophy, it might be its inevitable destination.